This is House Planning Help, episode 157. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is James Galpin from HazleMcCormackYoung Architects, and we have a case study of Mayfield Passivhaus. This is a contemporary home set in a traditional English village. Doesn't get much more traditional than this. So we've got a few interesting things in this chat. Firstly, getting the planning permission in this area, definitely a challenge. And this house is all about the garden, really. It's got a very, very strong connection with the garden. We've got some good budgeting advice in here and just the whole story. We like case studies on this podcast. So that to come in a few moments. This is the last podcast of 2016, though. So I want to say thank you. Firstly, to our guests, those in the construction industry who openly share their knowledge and experience. Also, self-builders who've survived the house building process and come back with all manner of insights. Thank you to you guys. The podcast would not be the same without all the information you bring to the table. Also to the team at House Planning Help. I definitely can't do this on my own. Thank you, Robin, Lucy, Kay, Mike, Lizzie, Steve, Ian, Tim. This is definitely a team effort. It's not just the podcast, it's the videos that we try and bring, all the stuff in the hub as well. And we want to keep on enhancing that, making it better and better as the years go on. So thank you. If I've forgotten to mention anyone, I apologise. We've got all sorts of freelancers as well who do bits and pieces. And finally, to you. Thank you for being there, for sharing this experience. I love making this podcast and trying to expand my knowledge of low energy architecture. And if you find it even just a tiny bit useful, then it's hallelujah, job done at this end. And I have a sneaky suspicion that 2017 is going to be a pivotal year for us at House Planning Help. So I hope you continue to stay with us. Let's get to our featured interview with James Galpin then from HazleMcCormackYoung Architects. We're hearing the story behind Mayfield Passivhaus today. First, though, I asked James to tell me a little bit about his background.
I'm an architect. I've been an architect since 1999, and my practice, HazleMcCormackYoung, is based in Canterbury and Tunbridge Wells. We primarily work on school design, but with a good tranche of new build houses as a secondary element. And office fit-outs, but they're few and far between since sort of 2000 or so. We specialise really in low-energy design, which is part of our ethos in design, and we bring that to every project we can, which is where Passivhaus has become a strong link for us. So we work mainly on Passivhaus houses, but we're now trying to introduce that same technology into school design, which we're finding it's a lot harder to get that through the process, but you know that's our current goal.
We're going to be looking at Mayfield Passivhaus today, so maybe you could just tell us about the plot and the brief as that came about and how you responded to it.
Yeah, we were appointed a long time ago now for this project. It was 2009, and the client undertook a limited competition locally. I think there were 6 architects interviewed. We came away with that project. And the brief really revolved around the site. It's a sort of 6 or 7 acre site in Mayfield, designed originally, landscape garden designed by Percy Crane. And it's a beautiful site, sort of very formally structured limestone terraces, long vistas of lavender and a rolling hill down to sort of the weald of Mayfield and Ticehurst and Wadhurst and all those areas that you're just looking out onto sort of open countryside. So the client wanted something that would replace the original building, which was an old bungalow with a converted roof. He wanted something that would be relatively timeless in its design, modern in its layout, but primarily connected with the garden. And so every space you feel inside, you're feeling a connection with the historic structure of the Crane landscape garden.
So how did you start to develop this and respond to the brief?
The hardest part, I suppose, was imagining how the site would be without the bungalow in its place. The council were quite keen, even from sort of early pre-app stage, the council were very keen to keep the footprint of the new building on the location of the previous one, which I disagreed with. I think it was in the wrong place, and it was an easy argument to make, really, because the structure was so formal in its layout. And the original building was so clearly in the wrong place, we kind of stepped aside from that restraint from the council. So it became about understanding the structure of the garden, understanding the vistas and the formal lines of the layout, and then superimposing the client's brief onto the garden, really. So there were long axes from the entrance to the site through to a beautiful cedar tree at the far end of the gardens, which formed the sort of the backbone of the whole thing. Then the Percy crane terraces formed external rooms, and it was then a case of making a collage of rooms for the inside of the house as well as the rooms for the outside, the crane landscape garden.
And the process of honing the designs, did you go backwards and forwards quite a bit, or was the client happy fairly soon after you'd shared those first images and ideas?
The footprint was quite quick to establish. They liked the idea of the house is essentially a three-dimensional Venn diagram, because there are two accommodation wings, both with symmetrical pitched roofs, and where the wings overlap is the entrance to the house. So the shared area of the Venn diagram is a large glass roof light over the top of the staircase, which is in the main entrance hall. And so that staircase and the roof light and the glazing on the axis between the entrance and the cedar tree sets up a very strong structure, which the client loved. And so that was fixed and established quite quickly. The parts that took longer was actually the client working out how they wanted to live. It's a south-facing house, so the majority of the accommodation is facing the main body of the landscape down the terraces. But the normal reaction would be to put the main living spaces on that area. And by that I mean the living room. And the client wanted that to begin with, but then realised that actually the way the family lives is that they spend all their time in the kitchen and the dining room, and that's what's become the modern living space. And he's a passionate chef. He likes to have the family around him while he's cooking. So all of those functions then move to the south of the building. And the living room has less connection with the terraces, but because of the way the building is stepped along the line of the axis, it shares sort of smaller areas of terrace, but also pokes out to become south-facing. So it the way they lived was, or the way they imagined themselves to live, played a strong part in the final layout of the rooms.
Man after my own heart. Definitely the kitchen will be the way to go for us in our project. Thinking about constraints, have we mentioned all of the constraints, or is this actually quite an open plot where anything could have happened?
It's quite open in topography terms. It's a sloping site, but it sits on a table of flat landscape. And that was absolutely the best place for the house because of the entrance route and that access. One of the constraints, I think, was the planning department and their first reaction about what they would expect to have on the site. And that was quite a traditional Wealden-type house. And it took me a little while to find the right officer to work with at the planning department, because there are forward-thinking planners, thankfully, in the area. And once we'd got a good working relationship with that planner, we were onto a more progressive route, which everyone would be happy with.
It's a funny one, isn't it? Planning is still, I would say, largely a mystery to me. I understand this because this is actually, we're talking about an area where I grew up in, and I love this area. But I think since I've started doing this podcast, I've also realised that if we just always kept on building the same things, that it's weird. Why would we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the planners are coming around to that way of thinking slowly, but they are doing that. I've got planning recently on a site just a few miles away from the Mayfield Passivhaus for a pair of houses where people have been trying for about 15 years to get planning on it. And design after design has been Wealden. It's within a walled garden site. So some designs were showing a Wealden design, others were showing very low buildings that would sit below the level of the garden wall, hide themselves from the public. And the two houses that I've designed there are proudly tall, brutally modern, and uncompromising in every aspect. And the planners loved it because they're getting bored of plain tiles and the more traditional layouts.
I often think when you actually visit these buildings, it's very different to what you might think looking at a picture or a plan.
Of the more modern ones, I think in the modern school of design, everything is about the building working, and it is that machine for living in, which is what makes Passivhaus so fantastic, because it's a technology that's applied to a building that gives it everything it needs to perform well as a shelter. And I think the designs, if they're done well, then they're thinking about the connection with the garden, they're thinking about light, they're thinking about the ergonomics of the space. And when it's done right, it feels comfortable because it's the right size, it's the right, it's using topography correctly, it's getting good views out. There's a safety in traditional design, and some traditional design is fantastic, obviously. It would have stuck if it wasn't. But there are many clients where you ask them if they want modern or traditional, they'll say traditional, and then during the course of the design, every choice you offer them, they're choosing the modern choice without realizing that that's modern. So it's kind of making something natural, making something feel right. That sets itself aside from any particular styling, I think.
Do buildings develop from the inside out almost?
Well, they should do, because you spend 18 hours a day inside one, if it's a live-work unit or something, and you spend 5 minutes approaching it. So it's the way the shelter works inside is essential. You see a lot of roof conversions and things done, and you look at them and think, well, I don't know how someone could have thought to do that. How can that be allowed? But of course, as a client, they're saying, well, what do I want for the space? And they're designing the space as they need the room to work. And then whatever happens on the roof just happens. It's a terrible shame, but I suspect it's really architects that get worried by that more than anyone else.
Let's focus on the way that this was built. Was that an easy choice? What system were we talking about? What method?
We knew we had a big challenge in terms of costs with the project. Whenever I design a building, I always ask the client their budget, and then I ask them what they need for each room. And we design sort of proportions room by room as an abstract graphic. And then I feed that back into a square meterage and say, well, actually, this goes beyond your budget, or sometimes it doesn't, but usually it does. And I say to them, what can you compromise on? Because I don't think we'll build that for the money that you're setting aside for the project. And this project was no different to that. The requirements were exceeding the budget, and there are elements of the design that I wanted to work in the way they do, which aren't necessarily the most space effective. So the square meterage was quite high for the building, and the budget was restrictive. So we were challenged with delivering for around about $1,750 a square meter, which is quite keen. That doesn't include landscape.
What does that include exactly in the build cost? I always get confused with this. Or does it change?
It includes removing the old building, flattening the site, making changes to the services below the ground to feed the new building, and then everything upwards from that, but not beyond it. So landscape really was the only element that wasn't included, other than professional fees and planning fees and building control and things.
How much inside? How much fitted out or kitted out?
Well, that was everything other than furniture, really. There was a built-in bar in the living room, built-in kitchens, obviously the built-in bathrooms. Everything is ready to move into.
And that's included in the build cost, or in this case?
Yeah. So to deliver for that cost, eBay was included. There were visits to Dodgy Dave in Bermondsey, I think, that happened to have a couple of bathroom suites in his garage. And
that sounds very resourced. I like this.
Well, you have to do what you need to do, really.
So who did that? Was that client or you?
That was the contractor, and he really, that was the choice of construction, which was the original question. That was really working with the contractor, to work out how we could deliver this building for the cost that the client wanted to spend. So the contractor was Richardson and Pete, and I'd worked with them previously on school projects. They're a specialist timber frame construction company. And I went to Martin Pete originally in the project and said, I've got this project. We want it to be a passive house. I know that's something that you're keen to work on. Can we work together to make sure that where we're spending money is a responsible spend and not wasteful, and to get the building for as low as we can get it for? And so Martin brought along his construction method of timber frame with the engineered joists. He fed in with elements that would make it as cost effective as possible, and he was ultra keen to make it cost effective because he wanted a certified passive house on his marketing, which he was quite open about from the start. It was something that he wanted to deliver, so he made sure it worked in many areas, and it was a great experience working with him. It's a good team.
You've worked on lots of low energy buildings before. Was this just almost a tiny step further because you were operating in this region already and you just, because this was your first passive house too?
It was, yeah. It is a step forward. It's a step up in terms of attention to detail, certainly. The theories are all very sensible. There's nothing there where you think, well, why would I do that? That doesn't make sense. Everything is kind of making use of the solar azimuth, for example, of bringing warmth in when you want it and keeping it out when you don't. These are all good common sense elements that we're taught really from as young as we can put a baseball cap on. That's why you do it. But the moving forward in terms of the air tightness detailing, the mechanical vent systems, that was all new knowledge, and it was all research that had to be done for that project. But it was similar to Richardson and Pete. It was something that I wanted to do. So when the client talked to me about the way they would use the building, it became clear that they have a London house. They were undecided whether they would be living full-time at the Mayfield house or not. And there was a chance that they would only use it for weekend use. So that seemed a very good opportunity to say to them, there is a way that we can deliver you this house that you'll arrive on a Friday night and it will be warm. And that was the beginning of the conversation really about Passive House. And if I'm totally honest, I think that I probably brought Passive House to the party when the client may not have ever thought to do it. But it was done for two reasons. But the main reason really was it was right for the site. But also I wanted to move into Passive House design. So the house went from being a bungalow that took most of the weekend to warm up to a house that has very low heating bills, almost no heating bills, that you arrive on that Friday night and it's warm. And the client couldn't be more delighted with that as it's delivered.
What was the biggest challenge on this whole project?
I would say cost was the biggest challenge. We had to be very careful with the spend. It was an unusual process that was so inclusive of the contractor from an early stage. We got planning for the job, and that was based upon my ideas of what would work as a passive house, but no early pass PHPP calculations done. It was based upon what I felt would work, and the budget was set from planning stage onwards. And so I'd set myself a challenge really of needing to deliver the passive house, needing to deliver for the cost. And at the time of moving forward to construction, that wasn't the cheapest way of building a project, but it was the right way, and it was the right thing for the client. So important to stretch things beyond the usual, the norm, and just try that bit harder.
I'm very interested in budgets because I don't fully understand how to get them as crystal clear as they can be. So is there any information you can give us on how you screwed down that budget, how you knew this bit was for that and this and this?
Really keeping things within the realm of what was normal for the contractor. They were well versed in timber frame. They built timber frame buildings all over Bedford and the Midlands, and it's something that they can put together very quickly and cost effectively. So if I working with the same contractor, if I was working down the line of brickwork and things, then that would be something that would blow the budget. So as soon as you know who you're going to work with, then you can start making choices based upon how you're going to deliver that best value. And if you're not working with a contractor, then there are cost indices that you can use to calculate those prices. But the normal route for me is to design a building that I enjoy, that I think meets the client's brief well, and that I think will be beautiful. And so there are choices that I make that aren't always based on cost. I think that's also correct to do. So you've got to pick your battles, really. And this one there was a sweet spot of working with timber, working with this house, working with the contractor, and we were able to deliver that concept for the price, which was good news.
Timber frame we know about. Maybe you could talk about the other aspects. Were the foundations quite easy? It was a slightly sloping site.
It was a raft foundation, the IsoQuick system. So that was really a case of just flattening everything, leveling it, putting the hardcore down, and then getting the polystyrene down. It was the first time I'd used that type of footing, which was, at first it was a bit nerve-wracking because the wise man built his house upon the stone, not polystyrene or the sand. But it works really well. I mean, it's a 300 millimeter slab that sits on the concrete, effectively sitting then on a shingle bed, and just the mass and the solidity of it holds everything down, which works well. The worry about that one was when we had an oil pipe leak, which was a bit alarming because you don't really want oil anywhere near polystyrene, but that turned out to be fine. We contained it.
Was this oil that was used once upon a time, or is there still oil for the property?
There still is oil. There's no gas on the site, so the original boiler was oil fired, and the new boiler, which is much smaller than the original property, but is still oil fired. And testament to the performance of the passive house, the client phoned me after they'd been in the property for the summer, and they'd been in, I think it was around about late November, and they phoned me to say that there was something wrong with the heating system. Must be because they'd run out of oil already, but the oil tank hadn't been filled up yet, so they hadn't had their first delivery. so the heating hadn't been on.
That's a good one. I like that story. What about finishing off the building then, and that cladding that's on there, and any stories arising from that part?
That was a bit of a hassle for the contractor, I think. His pricing hadn't allowed for how rigid I would be with where the battens would need to go. I wanted the fixings of the timber to create a sort of secondary structure, if you like, on the facade, and wanted the fixings to be exposed so that you felt those lines of the fixing. But of course, if you're going to expose the fixings, then the battens need to be in a certain place because that's what you're fixing to. So there were a few kind of attempts at getting those battens right, and a few times I explained about why the battens were where they were. And it's all about communication, isn't it? But once they understood the reasons for it, I think they were fully behind it too. But the detailing is getting the reveals of the windows right is key with that kind of. It's a hit and miss timber cladding. So there's a layer of vertical timber fixed to the battens, and then a second layer of vertical timber fixed on the outside of those timbers. So you get a kind of crenulated vertical effect of the timber. So every time you get a break in that, it's important to get the vertical aligning with the window jambs so that you read the structure properly and you don't get sort of half a piece of cladding that starts at a window position. So every window was sort of detailed in elevation with the 18 millimeter timbers kind of set out so that you knew they'd be in the right places. So there's a lot of juggling to do on that, and it had to be quite sort of tightly coordinated. But the result's worth it, so that's good.
Any lessons learned on this one?
Yeah, loads. I mean, the whole passive house lesson was enormous. The design for the PHPP was done by Arbon, Phil Neve at Arbon, and the communication was great, but there were elements of the design that I was thinking would work, because things like that big roof light in the centre, that was a big challenge, because the way I imagined it would work was that the roof light would be a radiator for the house, and there'd be extra extract vents taken from next to the glass of the roof light, so that would feed in. So if the sun was out, even on a really cold winter's day, then the house would be warm. The whole house would be warm. But we hadn't coordinated that. We hadn't communicated that between us. And so those extract vents were put in later on. And, there's ducts and everything allowed for it, so it wasn't a problem. But it was kind of learning hand in hand. I think we were both learning through that process. And so even after so many years in practice, it was a lesson for me to communicate properly, to explain the ideas, the concepts, even to somebody that is a specialist in the area, because they don't know why you're doing certain things, and they'll engineer ways around it, which is their job. That's how they do it. But if you don't communicate your ideas completely, then you miss a trick as a whole team. So it's I think we all learned quite a lot from the project, which was great.
And you've mentioned to me that you're trying to do a few more passive house projects now, so clearly good for business, but some of them you're concerned might not get there. So why?
Well, the houses within the walled garden that I mentioned were a passive house design, but they're self-build, but self-build developer, so they'll be built and then sold on. One of the houses is now going to be lived in by the builder because he's fallen in love with it during the process. But during the delivery, the questions came of, well, why have I got 350 mil studs on the walls? I can do this in 140. And not with passive house, you can't. You need a higher level of thermal performance, and you need that insulation to sit within a structural zone. So the timber frame costs would have been a lot more, and it was deliverable with a much smaller timber frame. So in that instance, the contractor said, "Well, no, I don't want to spend the money," and said goodbye to passive house at that point, which was a great shame. There's only so much arguing for the cause that you can do. And if it goes beyond what the client's willing to spend, then it's very difficult to achieve. I think for that one, it was clear early on, the first choice, the timber frame, there was a cost saving made. We'd never have made it all the way through passive house. There's 1,000 choices to make, and it's important you make the right choice on every one of those choices, or you don't get your certification. So we've got a similar job to the Mayfield Passivhaus, this one a bit bigger, but it's a passive house over in Buxted. And with that one, the design for the living room space is a double height glass living room. The shading and the heat gain in the double height space may be too difficult to deliver in passive house. We're working on that at the moment. But if it is, the client will keep the class, and he'll end up with a ventilated house that has heat recovery, that's very well insulated, but won't be certified because it won't quite reach the standard. So there's a holy grail, I think, of the certified passive house, and it's absolutely worth following. But the technology that we're working with, having that technology employed is great, and buildings get better because of it. But you have to be very careful, obviously, of the overheating, which is a particular problem in some low-energy houses. Not in passive houses, but in some low-energy buildings.
You led your clients down this road, so how have they reacted? How long have they been in as well?
I've been in about 18 months now, and we've just sort of finished all of the end of defects work, so the final retentions have been released. They've loved it. I've got them on film, actually, saying that it's the first house they've ever lived in where every space you go into is equally comfortable. Every corner of every room is sort of the same as the others, fresh but warm and comfortable. And they love the way the house connects with the garden, which I'm pleased about because that was obviously the first part of the brief. But the way the house is so comfortable, I think, has really taken them aback because they took quite a leap of faith in it. They said, well, we don't want to be guinea pigs. So we had to remind them that this has been done for the last 20 years or so, but just not so much in England. But they're delighted with the house and they love living there. And I think they're now moving down there sort of more permanently. So it's the house they want to be in, which is good.
And just finally, we all hope to build a house in future. So this doesn't necessarily have to be anything to do with passive house, but just some tips for self-builders, things that you might have observed through numerous clients, things that might help us coming into this process.
Well, I think building a collection of ideas of things that make you feel at home is important. It's the first question I always ask a client is, what's your definition of home? What do you feel is home? And the answers to that range quite wildly from, that connection with the garden and feeling the landscape through to good Wi-Fi, must have good Wi-Fi. So everyone has different goals. But if you see spaces that you particularly feel comfortable in, it's important to sit and think about the space and work out what it is about that space that makes you feel comfortable. And it might be a solid wall behind you while you've got a good vision out into the garden, or it might be the soft furnishings. But whatever it is, if you can analyse what that critical aspect is, then that's got to be your starting point for whatever you end up building. It's a long process, and you've got to get to the end of the process and feel like you're in the space that you hoped for, even if the actual detail is different when you get there. It's got to function as your shelter.
James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session, houseplanninghelp.com/157. There you can review the key points, check out some of the build photos. Perhaps you've got a comment or a question that you'd like to ask, just scroll down to the bottom. We can get you linked up with HazleMcCormackYoung Architects, James on Twitter. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/157. My call to action is to get yourself on the VIP early bird list for the Hub. Enrollment has currently closed, but be first to find out when it's going to reopen in 2017. HousePlanningHelp.com/join. Remember, all our hub members at the moment have the benefits of the learning modules, the monthly progress calls, the video case studies, the private members forum. And to get more information, HousePlanningHelp.com/join and sign up to our VIP early bird list. Now, next time, architect and author Pat Borer is my guest as we kick off 2017. We look at what he's learned over the past 40 years of being involved with the Centre for Alternative Technology. We've not actually talked about that much on the podcast, but obviously it's had a huge impact over there in Machynlleth, Wales. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you can catch up next time. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.